Okay, so having Nietzsche, we're moving in The Birth of Tragedy here to sections 5 and 6. So in the foregoing chapters, we have seen Nietzsche define what he means by Apollo versus Dionysus and what their respective spheres are. Apollo is the god of dreams, Dionysus is the god of intoxication. And now what he's going to proceed to do is he's slowly moving toward, he's getting toward the idea of the birth of tragedy out of the spirit of music and how this happens. But first he wants to cover all his bases. And in the ancient world, there were three literary modes, three primary modes: the epic, the dramatic, and the lyric. The lyric mode is the simplest to understand. It's simply the poetic mode where the poet speaks in first person. I feel great today. I feel like hell. It usually uses the first person. Traditionally it does, anyway. So that's lyric poetry. The dramatic mode eliminates the first-person subject and just lets the characters do the talking. You introduce, I think Aeschylus is the first to introduce the second actor on stage, and you have the back and forth between the two actors. That's the dramatic mode. In the epic mode, you might have a narrator who says some things in first person and then goes back and lets the characters speak for themselves. So it's a mixed mode that flips back and forth. At least this is the simplest way these three modes are to be understood, have been understood. But I think now what Nietzsche wants to do is go through them his way and relate them to his transformation of Schopenhauer's aesthetics via his idea of Apollo and Dionysus. So he's already given a nod to Homer as the great epic poet who is the pure Apollonian creator of a pure Apollonian dream world. And he says that in antiquity, the two most famous poets were actually Homer and this guy named Archilochus, which most people have probably not heard of because very little of his writing has survived. And he is known as the inventor of lyric poetry. He lives about 50 years after Homer. So with Homer, so note that those three modes originate first with Homer with the epic, second, 750 BC, let's say, second with Archilochus around 700, and then thirdly the drama with Aeschylus and company about 550 BC. So that's the order that they come into being. So Nietzsche, as he's getting to the drama, the tragedy, and the dithyramb, wants to worm his way here through the epic and the lyric first. So it's important to understand between Homer and Aeschylus what the nature of lyric poetry is and how it functions. And Archilochus is thought to be the great originator of it. But the thing about Archilochus, and this, I looked up a few of his fragments, and he had a reputation for being quite brutal and savage in his expressing his emotions. He's very raw, and has therefore often been characterized as subjective. Homer is objective, Archilochus is subjective, because he's always talking about his feelings and emotions. And there's a story that's probably apocryphal to the effect that he wanted to marry the daughter of Lycombes. Lycombes forbade it, and so Archilochus wrote a poem so savage and full of scorn that Lycombes and his daughter both went and hung themselves as a result of this. It's probably apocryphal, as I say, but what it does do is illustrate the power and force of the raw savagery of Archilochus's first-person poems. So he had a reputation for being a guy you didn't mess around with. So Nietzsche wants to get rid of this idea that Archilochus is subjective. He wants to get rid of the idea of any kind of subjectivity whatsoever in a work of art is for him a no-go. The subjective destroys art. It is because it destroys the disinterested, purely contemplative relationship of the intellect to the aesthetic object. So we have an opposition here between, recall, Schopenhauer's will, which is unaesthetic by its very nature, since the will runs through all things, drives all the instincts and biological forces, passions and desires and everything, and it's never disinterested. Whereas the intellect is what is able to achieve through aesthetic arrest a disinterested relationship to the object. And if we're just in a subjective mode here, then how is that any different? It can't be art if you're just imitating a person's willing relationship, desiring or fearing relationship to the object that is represented. So he says the key to this, he thinks, is the fact that in antiquity, the lyric poet, par excellence, was always regarded as a musician. Unlike the times even in which Nietzsche is living. Hölderlin wasn't a musician, let's say, but the lyric poets, they were like our rock and roll stars. They were always musicians as well, and so therefore embedded in the Dionysian. As a musician, as it turns out, the Dionysian will is moving through Archilochus and wears his subjectivity as a mask, which it uses to speak through him and puts him into the same aesthetic arena of the world of disinterested objects as all these other Apollonian objects. So when Archilochus says I, it's never the waking daylight ego of Archilochus, the banal drunk guy, let's say, or whoever he is. It's never that guy. The will through his lyric poetry wears him as a mask and speaks through him. So it's not subjective at all. It's very important. I think, imagine what Nietzsche would say, let's say, about the confessionalist school of poets that came out of New York in the 60s. He would just regard all of that as junk, ego droppings, totally degenerate art. We're talking about real art here in the classical tradition. So that's his discussion of this first part here of Archilochus. And then he quotes Schopenhauer's idea of... Schopenhauer had this idea, and this is important to understand as well, that music is different from all the other arts. With all the other arts, what we have are manifestations in the aesthetic arena of Platonic ideas. A cathedral, let's say, is the Platonic idea of the New Jerusalem, incarnated in stone. So it doesn't matter what the art is. It's all Platonic ideas as far as Schopenhauer was concerned. And because the arts manifest Platonic forms, in an ideal sense, this is what creates the aesthetic arrest of disinterested observation, except music. Music, he says, is the closest of all of the art forms to the actual objectification of the will itself. It is the world as will, with its passions and its desires. It's almost entirely made up out of emotions. But so, Schopenhauer quotes him to the effect that with song, when he's talking about the singer, the lyrical singer, the person who's singing, is sort of going back and forth between the world as will with the music and his own observations as a merely willing subject, back and forth. And for Nietzsche, this mixes up the subjective and the objective, like he says in the next paragraph, and he says, Schopenhauer has this wrong. Yes, music is an objectification of the will, but the singer is not a mixture of the subjective and the objective, because any degree of subjectivity whatsoever cannot be the origin of the art, but the destroying force of art. And so the singer embodies elements of both Apollonian and Dionysian, but not subjectivity and objectivity. He is always in the aesthetic mode. And so he says at the beginning of the next section, in section 6, that there is a tradition also that Archilochus was not just the inventor of the lyric, but of the folk song as well. Archilochus brings in the folk song, which is a union of the Apollonian and the Dionysian. And he says, in the folk song, what we have is melody as primary, and melody is therefore primary and universal, found all throughout the world. Folk songs are present everywhere you go. And in folk songs, language is trying to imitate music. It's sort of trying to overcode the music. So you get language imitating the music in the folk song, whereas in the epic mode, you get language imitating the world of phenomena, the world as it appears in a phenomenal sense, though transfigured into Apollonian dream logic. There's always got to be an aesthetic transformation for Nietzsche in any of these things. The world is never just a copy, a realistic copy of the outer world. Realism for Nietzsche is the death of all art. And indeed, I'm afraid I have to agree with him that it is. Realism is the death of all art. Art is and it consists of an aesthetic transfiguration. And so he says then that, so he's moving then in this discussion toward, he puts in a little note here where he says, keep in mind that music is not the will. It isn't just the will. As Schopenhauer says, it's not just the will, because if it were the will, then the will is unaesthetic. It's at odds with disinterested aesthetic contemplation. So it can't just be the will, but it appears in the aesthetic arena as the will. That's what it does. It's not the will, but it's representation transfigured in the aesthetic arena. And so this is Nietzsche's discussion then of the lyric mode, which is both Apollonian and Dionysian. So he's got the epic mode, just to recap then. So he has the epic mode originating with Homer as predominantly and primarily Apollonian. Then he has the lyric mode coming in here with both lyric poetry and the folk song as a mixture of Apollonian and Dionysian. But he says that the lyric mode, and why he discusses Archilochus, is that this is the seed, the germ from out of which tragedy will grow, from out of which the dramatic dithyramb will grow. This is why he's spending so much time on discussing lyric poetry, because the title of the book, recall, and which is why I think it was a mistake to change the title, is The Birth of Tragedy Out of the Spirit of Music. The dramatic narrative, as we'll see, tragedy emerges out of these folk songs, out of this lyric poetry. It's always musical, fundamentally and predominantly. Music is always there with it, which is why in the last half of the book he regards Wagner's operas as a rebirth of tragedy, with Wagner's fusion in opera of music with myth. So that's the telos, that's the goal, that's where Nietzsche is headed. So we'll stop there at section 7.